Good evening. Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening. Good evening, good evening, good evening. There we go. Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful day. I hope that everyone had a peaceful and thoughtful Memorial Day, right? I am manning 3 cameras tonight, so pray for me. We're going to pray that they all stay up tonight. So, yeah, Prophet, I pray for me. Please. I always solicit the prayers of the We Dare Squad. So tonight is Black Table Talk. I have been all day long in a classroom with first graders. So pray for me. That was a revelation in and of itself. So I'm going to my Facebook page, and if you all would, if you could go to Daring Dialogues real quick, pop out of where you are, and if you would go to Daring Dialogues and share tonight's broadcast onto your page, that will help me get the word out. Also, if you will go ahead and tweet out on Twitter. I am sing along all out. Yes, I was doing lots of singing today to keep children's attention. So I'm not gonna tell y'all that the same behaviors I saw in the first graders are the same behaviors I saw in the 12th graders. Yeah, that again was a revelation. So tonight we are back in some of our favorite books right now. We are in Spare the Kids by Dr. Stacy Patton. We are in Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. And I did find out that he is a FAMU alumni. So that's pretty cool. And we're also going to tie it into Dr. Claude Anderson's book, Dirty Little Secrets. I believe this is the first volume about Black history, its heroes, and other troublemakers. So we're going to tie it all in together tonight because it seems like even though it's 3 different books, I don't care what 3 different books it is. And anywhere I stop in these books these days, it seems like all the things that I'm reading sort of tie in together unplanned. So tonight we're continuing the conversation in Spare the Kids. That's what we're going to start first about would Jesus whoop a child? Then we're going to move over to talking about the Jefferson era. All right, the Jefferson era and Phyllis Wheatley. And then we're going to finish up with some things about paid professional slave beaters and some little known facts about Phyllis Wheatley. So that's where we're going to end. So again, I hope you all had a great memorial time. You know, people are thinking about their loved ones. They're thinking about people who were lost, due to war. I got a chance to teach on Memorial Day, and I noticed how the public school lesson forgot to tell the first graders that Memorial Day started as Decoration Day, and it was started by the formerly enslaved. So I made sure that I added that to their history lesson today, so that they could get that information. So let's deal with Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. We left off talking about a theologian out of the Richmond, Virginia area who is sort of tackling Black trauma and the role of religion as a coping mechanism. And her name is Lisette Cross. And she is out of the Richmond, Virginia area. And we're going to continue talking about this author's research, right, and interviews with Black ministers about the prevalence of beating children within the Black community, within the Black faith community, and we're going to look at what they had to say about it versus Scripture. All right. The Reverend Cross believes that the patriarchal structure of the Black church may be part of the problem contributing to violent parenting. Black women, often responsible for overseeing the day-to-day in the church, in the family, and the community, fill church pews yet are rarely seen in the pulpit, she says. Black women are shaped by the messages that come from religious leaders about being good wives and mothers, and the latter includes discipline. The interpretation of Scripture can help and hinder us. She adds, quote, Blacks in the early 20th century knew that if you did not beat your child, someone else could kill them. The belief was that if I instill the fear of God at home, then when they're out in the community, you won't look a white person in the eye and get killed. You recognize your place. You were taught to honor your mother and father, but what does it mean to honor your parents at your own expense, even though they might be beating you every week? These kinds of messages are so strong in the Black community, that even folks who don't attend church regularly or at all are impacted by them. The Reverend Cross argues that the way people parent is often a reflection of their image of God. This is absolutely true. The way people parent is often a reflection of their image and what they were taught about God and what they believe about God. All right? If your image is one of only fire and brimstone and a revengeful or vengeful God, then it might seem natural to beat children. But our role as parents and caretakers is actually to cultivate children, not beat them. Oh my, we already we're going to be on 10 apparently tonight. So I want you to imagine getting a flower. I have a whole bunch of flowers in front of me, but I want you to imagine a flower, and I want you to imagine beating that flower into the ground and commanding it to blossom. If you walk by somebody beating flowers and commanding them to blossom and commanding them to grow, you would probably have that person committed, right? You'd probably think something was off with them. But yet we do that to children. Just let it marinate. I know, just let it marinate. We want to beat something out of them. We want to beat them into blossoming and growing and blooming. And we don't realize that we are actually destroying them in the process because somebody misinterpreted Scripture and said that that's what that meant. To discipline your child meant to physically, violently harm them. That's what some people were taught. All right. So we are actually supposed to be cultivating children, not beating them. And guess what? Cultivation actually takes time. Cultivation actually takes thought, right? I got a chance to be reminded of what it's like to have 24 children along the ages of about 6, 7 in class, and speaking to them in a way that they would hear, because you're in public school, so you surely cannot put your hands on them. So how are you going to get them to listen, follow directions, and do what you ask without laying a hand on them? Maybe some parents should spend a couple of days in public school and get that practice in of how do you actually discipline without putting your hands on somebody. Because you have to do it as a teacher, unless you want to go to jail or be on the 6 o'clock news or be on somebody's live stream, right? So the Reverend Cross recognizes that the Black church has condoned physical punishment against children because of the historical role it played as a seemingly protective institution against white racist terror. Once we leave the church after service, we must then navigate an environment that hates Black bodies. Say that again because it's still true today. Mhm. Once we leave the church service, we must navigate an environment that hates Black bodies. Good evening. All right. And in today's society, you may not even get a chance to leave the church before you are experiencing somebody that hates your Black body. Ask the Charleston Nine, who were in their own Bible study in their quote unquote safe environmental space, and it was invaded by a murderer. So you can't even count on that these days, that you're going to automatically be in a safe space, because there's always a possibility of some unfortunate person that decides that they want to take someone's life out of hatred. So that's not even guaranteed. At the end of the day, we have to lean on one another, she says. I can't tell you to stop whooping your child if it keeps them from harm in the streets. The thinking is that it's better for us to take care of our own in our homes and churches than to deal with the evil, inhumane way that we are treated in the white world, she says. Well, the problem with that is there have been children that have been perfectly obedient, perfectly kind, and they've been murdered. There have been children that have been rude and disrespectful and out of line with adults, and they have been murdered. So it's not even necessarily that if your child is more well behaved, that they have less of a chance of being killed by the police. I know that that is the thinking of a lot of people, but if you go and start looking at some of the cases of the unarmed young teenagers that were shot and killed by police, you will find that a lot of them were students. A lot of them were honor roll students. A lot of them were minding their own business. Like, I think it was 2 years ago, a boy and his friends were at a party, and there was some shooting or something going on supposedly, and people started running away from the house, and he and his friends were in the car, and they started backing out, and the police blocked them in and began shooting at the car, killing, I believe, one of the passengers. They weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't in the quote unquote wrong place at the wrong time. All right. So we have to think about and consider what we are saying. What do we think about our children? And we need to make sure that we're not buying into stereotypes that our children, Black children, deserve more physical punishment than anybody else's child in order to quote unquote protect them. The Reverend Cross said that those parents who whooped us weren't necessarily bad people. They were doing the best they could to protect us. The pain they caused was wrong, but changing behavior and culture can be hard. We don't have enough courage or enough boldness or power to say, no, that's wrong, because we don't know what it's going to take to survive in a white supremacist world. But we can't respond with only one solution to the systemic, multi-layered issues of living Black in the United States. We can't expect people to throw out a tradition that they have grown up with. That's akin to throwing out Big Mama in them who taught us these things. She wonders, how do we separate the two? Thinking about the physical and psychological cost to children and to the larger Black community, the Reverend Cross questions the ways that religion works in concert with the culture of whoopings. She believes that we need to retire the rod, but also rethink many of the messages that we've learned from Christian doctrine. What does it mean for us to have permission to tell our own stories so that we can understand a picture of God that may not be in line with the picture of God that the church has painted? What does it mean to reconstruct our theology? What would it look like to erase everything that we currently understand about Christianity so that we can create something that is biblically aligned for our future generations? Similarly, the Reverend Leslie Callahan, a mother of a 3-year-old daughter and pastor of St. Paul's Baptist Church in Philadelphia, often talks with church folks about whooping kids. Black folks tend to take corporal punishment as part of our cultural inheritance. And we've already talked about before how it is not NOT. Somebody can type that. It is not a part of our cultural inheritance. And I don't care how many black people I run across that think that it is. The reality is it's not. All right? It was a cultural belief that was pressed in upon us as a people, and many black people did it out of fear for what could happen in a white supremacist society, but it is not our culture. One more time. It's not a part of our cultural heritage. It was foisted upon us. All right? So, when I encounter in my conversations a more pervasive understanding that it is the job of the parent to make their children compliant, they object to any characterization of hitting children as violence. They recognize violence as evil and acknowledge that doing violence to somebody you love is a bad thing, but they don't connect the violence of hitting with all the other violences that go on that bring damage to people. People separate it out because they think, well, that's just a child, but you're still bringing violence to that child's body. Okay? To call physically punishing a child violence would be to acknowledge that it is a bad thing. Parents don't always offer a real theological justification for it. They say they need to keep the kids alive. But there's a relationship between what black parents do to their kids at home and what's going on in the streets. The Reverend Callahan describes the pervasiveness of this parental mindset. A lot of people say, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out. Raise your hand if your parents said that. Or here's another one. It took me 9 months to bring you into this world, so I have a right to beat you. Children are the fruit of my decision. They belong to me. There's a pervasiveness of this attitude. It is the root and at the root of the village concept. The village can beat you all the way home. Raise your hand if you grew up in a time where the village beat you, and sometimes beat you all the way home. You might have gotten, I know in my day, they were just getting rid of corporal punishment in public schools. So my kindergarten year of public school, I got a whooping from my teacher. I know I'm dating myself, but I got a whooping from my teacher. And then my teacher, when my mom brought me in, when my teacher would bring my mom in to come pick me up from school, she would tell me what I did in school. And then my mother would beat me. Then when my mother got me home, she was still so angry about whatever I did in school. She would tell the neighbor or she would tell her friend, and then they would want to beat me. So that would be 3 whoopings for 1 offense. I'm sorry, people, but that's dysfunctional. I don't care what way you cut it. That's dysfunctional. You know what your children learn to do? They learn to lie better. They learn that next time I'm going to make sure I don't get caught. That's what's going to happen. It's not going to be I learned my lesson. It's going to be I'm going to do it better next time, and I'm going to make sure I don't get caught. So if any parent out there is fooling themselves thinking that they taught their child a lesson by beating them, you only taught them how to do it better and not get caught the next time. Because in their minds, if they're determined to do it again, all they're thinking now is, how can I do it better and not get caught? Thank you, Pastor Ben. They become professionals at it. Just trying to help some parents here, okay? So there is the village concept. Your village beats you all the way home. Okay. She says, I never got spanked by anybody else in the neighborhood. They would call my mama and tell her what I was doing. Sometimes your neighbors would be kind and call your parents and tell them what you were doing, and then you would just get a whooping by your parents. Other times your neighbors would beat you, and then they would bring you to your parent, and your parent would beat you. And then there were those rare neighbors that if they caught you doing something wrong, they would actually have a conversation with you. And you were actually so thankful that they had a conversation with you that you said, now I know I received a miracle and some grace because all they did was have a conversation with me and they didn't tell my mother or my dad. We tended to look at those people in our community more so as allies that we might go to in the future if we did something and we didn't know how to get out of it. We would probably go to them before we went to the person that automatically beat us. Yeah. So those are the people in my life, in terms of my village, those are the people I actually remember. The ones that actually had a conversation with me, asked me some questions, asked me why I was doing what I was doing, asked me what would happen if I got caught, asked me how would it make my family feel if they found out what I was doing. Those are the people that I remember. And because they gave me that grace and that verbal warning, it made me rethink what I was getting ready to do. As far as the people who beat me and then took me to the home, to my mother's home, and my mother beat me again, I don't remember their names. Just trying to help somebody here. She highlights how capitalism, white supremacy, and Christianity are intertwined. So much so that lessons are learned even when someone isn't practicing Christianity. Even the folks who are not churched still harbor this cultural sense that creates the attachment towards spanking. We seem to believe, and I'm going to ask all the Black people that are watching me tonight that are out here that have this mindset, I'm going to ask you to repent. We seem to believe that Black kids or Black children are worse than everybody else's children. Therefore, if Susie Q over here does the exact same thing, we want to sit down and we have a conversation with Susie Q. But if Shaniqua does the same thing, we automatically go to Shaniqua deserves to get her tail beat because she's hot or she's fast or she whatever adjective you want to put on front of Shaniqua. Shaniqua needs to be beat into complicity. Susie Q just needs a conversation. That's what we do. We send them to school and they are treated bad at school. Now, again, I'm going to pose this again because we've been talking about the rise of suicide in young children, in children ages 9 to like 12. There's an increase in the rise of suicide, especially amongst Black children. So I want you to get this in your head. They get chastised, mistreated, punished, and beaten at home. Then they get to school and they're treated like trash. And then their peers are treating them like trash. And then you're wondering why the suicide rate is on the rise. You're wondering why? Or have you not figured this out yet? Because if I'm getting treated bad by my peers, I'm being isolated from them, I'm being treated bad maybe by my administration staff, I've maybe been labeled, or I may have been given detention a couple times, or indoor suspension or outdoor suspension. So I don't have an ally in my school to go to have a talk about what's happening with my peers. So I take what's my peer pressure, my administration, isolates me. And then I go home on top of that, and I might be hearing, you ain't nothing, you're dumb, when are you ever going to get something right? And all the other negative messaging that people give their children at home. And then the child goes in the closet and hangs himself. And then everybody in the community is looking crazy. Like they don't understand all of the series of events that led to that. So when people say, I read some of these articles, the recent ones, and the parents are always saying they didn't know what was going on, or they knew their child was being bullied, but they figured that their child could take it, or, they just told their child to ignore it, which is not really addressing it, which is not really calling the administration to address it, which is not really getting your child actual counseling. And then your child goes and commits suicide. Now, we're not saying that all of these suicidal, ideations and attempts are the results of the parents. But what I am saying is you have to look at the environment that's being created that makes it conducive to it. And if a child feels like they do not have an ally in any aspect of their life, they could very well choose to end their life. That is where we are in this society, okay? So I want you to think about that. We send them to school and they are treated bad. Our kids are constantly institutionalized in the most oppressive ways. Many of them have to wear uniforms and walk in a straight line. There is a zero tolerance behavior policy in most schools. There is no second chance. You strike out once, you're out. You have to be mean to them for everything. It's deeply embedded in white supremacy. What happens if you just love your children? What happens if you make a commitment today and you say, I am going to honor my child as a little human that I'm raising, as a little person that I'm raising, as a future adult that I'm raising? How would that change what you're doing with your child? To convey this point, she shares the story of a single mom who brought her son to church on Bible study night so the pastor could beat him in his office. I can hear the kid crying, I said. I can't stay here in this church. If you are treating your kid this way, then what are you telling him? And what you are telling him is that you can't parent him. If you're bringing your child to church for the pastor to beat them, can I get you to stop doing that? I don't know who we might be talking to tonight, but if you're using your pastor, your spiritual leader to beat your child, you are connecting spiritual leadership to abuse in the child's brain. You're wiring them to think that God is abusive. Can I get you to just don't do that, okay? I don't know who might be doing that, but please stop. This happens a lot with boys, the Reverend Callahan says. There's a lot of conversation in our community about the firmness Black boys need. They don't get this when parented by single women, which affects the ways women think they must parent. They think they must be hard to make up for the absence of a male parent, rather than finding the child a male role model. But that's not the solution, she says. What would be helpful to Black boys would be for them to be loved more, coddled less, but loved more. Some of the men's aggression in women's lives actually has to do with the anger surrounding the women who raised them. So, your son's girlfriend, your son's wife is going to get the brunt of how they feel about your parenting women. Okay. Single mothers, your son's girlfriend or friends, plural, and his future wife are going to get the blunt or the brunt of how they feel about your parenting. So check out the domestic violence rates and then go have a talk with the men who are involved in these domestic violence issues. And you're going to find out that there is some sort of either dysfunctional or completely toxic way they feel about their mother and the parenting. Despite the efforts to rationalize violent parenting with references to scripture, she does not believe that Jesus would whoop a child. No, I would talk about what the scriptures say Jesus actually did with children. Jesus, taking a child, said, "Look at this child. If you welcome this child, you welcome God." It does not say if you whoop this child, you welcome God. It says if you welcome this child, you welcome God. Jesus was a childless man. For all the people out there who say, well, you don't have any children, so you can't be telling us about no parenting because you don't have no children. Jesus was a childless man, but he centered the personhood of the child. As a matter of fact, he said, if you do something to harm one of these little ones, it would be better if somebody put a millstone, a chain with a stone around your neck and threw you into the water. Because what's going to happen to you, according to Jesus, is going to be worse than that for harming little children. I guess we missed that in scripture, maybe. All of us have been children. When someone says, you don't understand what it's like. Yes, I do. I was a child at one point. So were you. We've all been children, and that's a position of privilege and insight. Do you remember being a child? Some of us need a reminder. Do you remember being a child? Maybe you actually need to remember and recall what it was like being a child to actually get some perspective on how you should treat the children before you. Do you remember the time that your parent hit you if you were hit? Do you remember your outrage and feeling the injustice of that hit? People have reinterpreted these experiences, but you actually don't forget the feeling of outrage. The body actually holds memory. As a parent, I don't want my child hurt or injured. Spanking is not the only method of delivery of discipline. It's the easier one for parents. Part of the issue is that despite all the revisionist religiosity and the efforts to use God to rationalize whooping children, there is no biblical or religious validation for this practice. The Reverend Callahan corrects the often cited spare the rod that is often used to defend spanking. This isn't what the Bible said. If you're going to use the Bible as a source, then get it right. The notion of the rod and staff is as comforting, not as provoking your children to wrath. Children experience spanking as an injustice done to their body. Rather than teaching them about consequences, you give them the sense and the feeling of injustice. As a matter of fact, you actually get your children used to injustice. Now, somebody don't want to hear that. You get them used to accepting injustice when you spank them. Rather than teaching them about consequences, you are actually giving them injustice. You cannot unspank a child. You can't restore the sense of bodily integrity. Physical discipline comes from your own ego. There's immense power in the church and its leadership because of the value bestowed upon Black ministers. Yet, changing the message from the pulpit isn't an ultimate panacea. If Black preachers collectively announced that spanking should stop, instead of told parents that they should take their children's feelings seriously, whoopings wouldn't instantly become ancient history. It might, however, start a conversation that would lead to better outcomes for children, the Reverend Callahan states. Black preachers say a lot of stuff that Black folks don't listen to. I can attest to that. People ignore us when they feel like it. I can attest to that. If we decided to take a position that the health and well being of our children require us to speak out if we were convinced of it ourselves, then change might be possible. Again, we're going to continue this conversation again next week. This is a long chapter, but it needs to be said. Stop beating your children. You are affecting their bodily integrity. You are affecting their mindset. You are getting them used to being dealt injustices in life. And then you wonder 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line why we have a generation that people are questioning, why are y'all just sitting back and taking all of these injustices? I wonder why. Could it be that we have a generation that has been beat into injustice? Could it be we have a generation whose bodily integrity has been violated so much that it's hard for them to speak up and realize that they're being served injustice? Something to think about. All right, we're going to Stamp from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. I see a lot of people beginning to talk about some racist ideas, but I always refer them to this book because he covers so much of what people only give you in little bites. So if you want a comprehensive history, I recommend getting this book so you can read it for yourself. And he has resource upon resource and reference upon reference on everything that he is sharing in this book. All right. So let's talk about Black exhibits and let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to introduce a little bit about Phillis Wheatley. And then we're going to talk about her through Dirty Little Secrets. Dr. Claude Anderson shares something about Phillis Wheatley that I didn't know, but I'm going to share it with you tonight. As Thomas Jefferson supervised the building of his plantation, which is still there, by the way, near Charlottesville. You know, Charlottesville, that was in the news where the girl died, Heather Heyer. Yeah, his plantation is still there. It's called Monticello, and you can actually go visit it. So if you're planning on coming to the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, Virginia region this summer, I recommend taking a tour of Monticello. They have actually uncovered, for I think this is a year now, they've uncovered Sally Hemings' room. Let me tell you how dastardly these people were. They were so sneaky back in the past that Sally Hemings' room actually used to be right near right near Thomas Jefferson's bedroom. And what they did was they actually hid her bedroom and they remodeled the plantation and turned her bedroom quarters into a bathroom so people wouldn't realize how close and how at his beck and call that Sally Hemings actually was. Well, somebody finally decided to tell the truth of the matter. And so they spent a couple of years actually digging through and digging up the bathroom that was there to actually uncover her room. So you can see how close she was to the master to be abused by the master. So you can actually go there this summer. It's Monticello. You can go and check it out. They have uncovered her space, and it's an exhibit piece on Sally Hemings as a part of the tour. So he was building this plantation in October of 1772. An enslaved 19-year-old woman up the coast was gazing anxiously at 18 gentlemen who identified publicly as the quote, most respectable characters in Boston. They all had been instructed to judge whether she had actually authored her own poetry, especially its sophisticated Greek and Latin imagery. She saw familiar faces: Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, future Governor James Baldwin, mega slaveholder John Hancock, and Cotton Mather's son Samuel, who was remembered as the last in the line of illustrious Mathers after Richard Increase in Cotton. Phillis Wheatley, the poet making her case before Samuel Mather and the other Bostonians, is now remembered as the first in the line of illustrious African American writers. Now, I want you to understand, she actually had to make a legal case that the writing that she wrote was hers because they didn't think she was smart enough to have written it. I just want you to think about that. Her enslavement story did not begin like that of many other African people. In 1761, Susanna Wheatley, the wife of tailor and financier John Wheatley, visited the newest storehouse of chained humanity in the southwest Boston, not far from where Cotton Mather used to live. Captain Peter Gwynn of the Phyllis had just arrived in Boston with 75 captives from Senegambia. Looking for a domestic servant, Susanna Wheatley scanned past the several robust, healthy females and laid her eyes on a sickly, naked little girl covered by a dirty carpet. Some of the 7-year-old captive's front baby teeth had come out, possibly reminding Wheatley of her 7-year-old daughter who had died. Susanna Wheatley was mourning the 9th anniversary of Sarah Wheatley's tragic death. Well, before she became the most famous Black exhibit in the Western world, the young African girl was most likely purchased by Susanna and John to serve as a living reminder of their dead daughter, Sarah Wheatley. Whatever her name, Wolof relatives had given her, it was now lost to gray chains, bloody blue waters, and scribbled history. The Wheatleys renamed her after the slave ship that had brought her to them. From the beginning, Phillis Wheatley had a child's place suggested in early biographer in the Wheatley's house and in their hearts. Homeschooled, Phillis never was looked on as a slave, but she was a slave, explained Hannah Mather Crocker, the granddaughter of Cotton Mather. After 4 years after her arrival, 11-year-old Phillis jotted down her first poem in English. Remember, she was coming from somewhere else, so she spoke and wrote other languages. It was a 4-line tribute to the 1764 death from smallpox of the 17-year-old daughter of the Thackers, a distinguished Puritan family. Phillis was moved to write the poem after overhearing the Wheatleys lament the tragic death of Sarah Thacker. By age 12, Phillis had no problem reading Latin and Greek classics, English literature, and the Bible. She published her first poem on Messrs. Hussey and Coffin in a December 1767 issue of the Newport Mercury. A storm had almost caused 2 local merchants to shipwreck off the Boston coast. The Wheatleys had one or both of the merchants over for dinner. Phillis listened intently as they shared their story of their narrow escape. In 1667, the 15-year-old composed to the University of Cambridge a poem that signified her longing to enter the all-white, all-male Harvard. excuse me, she had already consumed the assimilationist ideas about her race that had probably been fed to her by the Wheatley family, saying, for instance, "'Twas but even now I left my native shore, the sable land of error's darkest night." Assimilationists were producing the racist idea of an unenlightened Africa and telling Wheatley and other black people that the light of America was a gift to them. The next year, Wheatley continued to marvel in her assimilation and attack segregationist curse theory in the poem on being brought from Africa to America. She wrote, "Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolical dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." In 1771, Phillis Wheatley began assembling her work into a collection, including a number of inspirational poems on the increasing tension between Britain and colonial America in the 1760s, which became her claim to fame. The Wheatleys figured that prospective publishers and buyers would need to be assured of her authenticity. This is why John Wheatley assembled a powerhouse of Boston elites in 1772. Hardly believing that an enslaved black woman could fathom or understand Greek and Latin, the 18 men probably asked her to unpack the classical allusions in her poems. Whatever their questions were, Wheatley dazzled the skeptical tribunal of 18 men. They signed the following assimilist attestation. "We whose names are underwritten do assure the world, because we are the tastemakers, we are the elitists. So if we say that this black girl did this, then it is good as gold." Gee, I wonder where I've heard that from. Okay. "We assure the world that the poem specified in the following page, as we were a young Negro girl who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa." So she became this black performance piece of quote unquote the what you could do with an uncivilized person from Africa and how you can bring them into culture and they can become this great person as they are nurtured under the hand of white people, basically. The Wheatleys were delighted. But even with this attestation in hand, no American publisher was willing to alienate slave-holding consumers by publishing her now famous poems, which were entering the abolitionist literature of the Revolutionary era. Phillis Wheatley had auditioned and proven the capability of Black humanity to the assimilist scions of Boston. But unlike the publishers, these men did not have much to lose. Phillis Wheatley was not the first so-called uncultivated barbarian to be examined and exhibited. Throughout the 18th century's race for enlightenment, assimilationists galloped around seeking out human experiments, barbarians, to civilize into the quote, superior ways of Europeans, to prove segregationists wrong and sometimes to prove the slaveholders wrong. As trained exotic creatures in the racist circus, Black people could showcase Black captivity for whiteness, for human equality, for something other than slavery. They could show they were capable of freedom someday. Few worked as passionately to provide this human evidence or put up as much money to experiment as John Montagu, England's second Duke of Montagu. Early in the 1700s, the Duke experimented, there's that word again, on the youngest son of Jamaica's first freed Blacks to see if he could match the intellectual achievements of his white peers. The Duke sent Francis Williams to an English academy in Cambridge University, where Francis equaled in intellectual attainment his peers were so similarly educated. Sometime between 1738 and 1740, Williams returned home, probably donning a white wig of curls over his dark skin and assimilated mind. He opened a grammar school for slaveholders' children and penned fawning Latin odes to every colonial governor of Jamaica. His 1758 anti-black poem to Governor George Haldane read, "Though dark the stream on which the tribute flows, not from the skin, but from the heart it rose." Celebrity Scottish philosopher David Hume learned about this Cambridge-trained Francis Williams. But neither Williams nor the growing fashion of having black boys as servants in England, nor Buffon's climate theory could change his mind about natural human hierarchy and blacks' incapability for whiteness. Hume declared his segregationist position emphatically. In 1753, he updated his popular critique of climate theory called Of Natural Characters, adding the most infamous footnote in the history of racist ideas. I'm going to read this footnote, and then I'm going to share with you from Dr. Claude Anderson's Dirty Little Secrets book a little bit about Phillis Wheatley. He writes, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites have still something eminent about them. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but it is likely he is admired for slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. He strongly opposed slavery, but like many other abolitionists of the Enlightenment period, he never saw his segregationist thinking as contradicting his anti-slavery stance. Ignoring his anti-slavery position, pro-slavery theorists over the next few decades used David Hume as a model, adopting his footnote as their international anthem." So yes, there are people out here who are staunchly against slavery, but they are for segregation. There's a couple of liberal people that are against slavery, but they are for segregation. They don't want you to beat up black people, but they also don't want black people in their neighborhoods. They don't want black people in their schools. Segregationists. Dirty Little Secrets is our last one, and then we are going to open up the lines for some commentary. So let's take a look at what Dr. Claude Anderson shares tonight about Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley was a talented black female poet who became a popular national and international talent at a time when the nation was writing a constitutional law codifying that blacks were only 3/5 of a human being. 20 years earlier, a white slave trader had kidnapped Phillis Wheatley out of Africa while she was but a child. In America, she was bought and educated by her white masters, the Wheatleys of Boston, who granted freedom and to a large extent became her patrons. At the age of 17, she wrote the first book ever published by an American black person. When her poetry became very popular, she had an audience with General George Washington. Later, she was sent to London to be received by prominent Englishmen and promptly charmed the court circles. She was seduced into believing that the world was colorblind. She concentrated on her writing skills and tried to find a world for herself beyond her race in high white society and in its literary environment. She was apolitical. In none of her poems or publications did she even speak out on the issues of race and slavery. She infused her writings with Christian sentiments rather than social commentaries. She believed her acceptance came because she was a talented individual who just happened to be black-skinned. Yeah, there are a lot of people who think the same way today. In 1773, racial realities began to come home to roost. When her book appeared in London, someone actually bound a copy of her book with the skin of a black person. Now, if you don't know this part of history, um, black people in some instances were actually flayed alive or barbecued, and their skin or their remains were actually used as clothing, as book covers, and a whole host of other gruesome things. I know people think that that only happened in the Holocaust, but it happened right here in America. And there are people who actually still sell these relics of books and clothing made out of the skin of murdered black people. Let's be clear about that. The Wheatley family went bankrupt 5 years later. She was free, but she was forced to fend for herself. She married John Peters, a free black man. Hardships worsened, causing her health to fail, and her husband was arrested and sent to debtor's prison. She died, like most members of her race, black-skinned and poverty-stricken. For a time, Phyllis Wheatley thought that her talent and her skills were going to help her escape the fate of many Black Americans of that time. And so, lesson number one in Blackness, don't forget you're Black. Okay? Just thought I'll leave you with that lesson for tonight. All right. I want to thank you for your time and attention. It has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I've been your host tonight, Shantae Charles. If you are watching us by Facebook, we're going to sign off. If you want to join us for our conversation after, you can meet us at pscp.tv/Life Nation. As a matter of fact, let me go ahead and type that up there for you as we're closing. Also, the same thing with YouTube. We're going to be /Life Nation. You can meet us there right now. All right. Signing off. Thank you, YouTubers. I appreciate you. If you have never heard of that, go look it up. It's pretty gruesome, though. You might not want to, if you don't have a stomach for it, don't look it up. But you can actually see some of the garments that are made out of the skin of those who have been murdered in this country. Thank you.